The barn door had not been opened in front of another living soul in almost 3 years, and when it finally swung wide that morning, the man standing outside it stopped breathing for a moment, because what stood before him was not what he expected to find behind an old farmhouse on the edge of a small American town. Wolves caught mid-howl, a soldier kneeling with his head bowed low, a dragon curling its long body around a fence post as though it had grown there on its own. Caleb Whitfield stood frozen in the middle of it all, a chisel still in his hand, sawdust clinging to his forearms, watching Walter Higgins take in every corner of the barn without saying a single word. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, because some things are too large for a first sentence, and to understand how a quiet boy ended up standing in the middle of a barn full of wooden creatures, you have to go back to where it all began, back before the barn was full, back to a pile of scrap wood and a grief that never quite found the words to speak itself out loud. Caleb was 17 and had not said more than a handful of sentences to anyone outside his house in longer than he could remember. He had always been a quiet boy, even before, but the silence had deepened into something heavier after his mother, Ellen Whitfield, passed away when he was 11, taken by a slow illness that spent one entire winter stealing him from him, a little at a time. Caleb still kept a small tin of buttons that belonged to her sewing box, plain wooden and brass buttons that meant nothing to anyone else in the world, and some nights he would sit alone in his room and simply hold one in his palm, rolling it between his fingers, because it was the only thing of hers that still carried a faint trace of the cedar chest she used to keep it in. He did not cry where people could see him. He did not talk about missing her. He carried her absence around like a stone in his pocket, and he touched it only when he was alone, in the dark, when the house had gone quiet and there was no one left to perform strength for. His father, Thomas, worked long hours at the feed and grain store in town, coming home most evenings with dust on his boots and grease under his fingernails, a man whose silence felt different from his son's, steadier like a fence post driven deep into the ground. What almost nobody in town knew, not even Caleb until many years later, was that Thomas carried his own version of that same stone, a habit of driving out past the county line on the anniversary of Ellen's passing, sitting alone in his truck for an hour before coming home, never once mentioning where he had been or why. He never sat his son down to talk through feelings. Instead, he showed his love in quieter ways, waking early to make breakfast before either of them had to speak, driving 40 minutes out of his way for a bicycle part, never once complaining about the growing pile of scrap wood that had begun collecting behind their property, dumped there weekly by the Rourke Lumber Company, logs and planks too warped or cracked to sell to anyone. Most people in town looked at that pile and saw exactly what it appeared to be: waste, junk, something better burned than kept. Caleb saw something else entirely, though even he could not have explained it in words at first. It began almost by accident, the year his mother died, when Caleb found her old pocket knife in a kitchen drawer, and without quite knowing why, wandered out to the scrap pile and began carving into a rotted piece of oak simply to have something to do with his hands. He was not trying to make anything. He was only trying to feel something other than the ache behind his ribs. But in the slow work of shaving curls of wood away, watching a shape emerge from something that had looked like nothing at all, Caleb found a quiet he had not felt since the funeral. He kept going back every week when the trucks dumped another load, studying the twisted trunks the way another boy might study a puzzle, searching patiently for the shape hidden somewhere inside. Word got around the way it always does in a small town, and it did not take long before Caleb became something of a joke among his classmates, who called him the scrap wood boy and laughed about the pile behind his house growing tall enough to burn down the whole county someday. Caleb never argued back. He absorbed it quietly, the same way he absorbed everything, and disappeared into the old barn his grandfather had built decades earlier, teaching himself woodworking with nothing but a coping saw, a set of dull chisels, and sandpaper worn thin from use. His first attempts were clumsy, a bird that looked more like a lump of clay, a horse with legs too short for its body, and he broke pieces constantly, splitting good wood from cutting too fast or misjudging the grain beneath the blade. But every mistake taught him something, and slowly, over that first year, his clumsy shapes sharpened into real skill, heroes from the stories his mother used to read him before bed, wolves and eagles caught mid-stride, and eventually the mythical creatures and monsters he had loved as a younger boy, before grief had made him quiet. Thomas noticed everything without saying much about it. The sawdust on Caleb's boots, the new blisters hardening slowly into calluses across his son's palms. He started setting aside a few extra dollars from each paycheck to buy Caleb a proper set of carving knives for his birthday, wrapped in plain brown paper, because that was all Thomas had ever known how to do with love, quietly and without ceremony or explanation. There was one evening, about a year and a half in, when Thomas found his son sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at a wolf sculpture he had just finished, its head thrown back in a long, mournful howl, caught forever in the grain of the wood. Thomas walked over, ran his rough hand along its carved spine, and said quietly that it looked like it was howling at something it missed. Caleb's throat tightened, because his father had said the one thing Caleb had never managed to say out loud in 6 long years. Thomas simply patted his shoulder, called it fine work, and went back inside, leaving his son with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being truly seen for the first time in a long while. The barn filled steadily after that, dozens of pieces lining every wall, while outside the pile of scrap kept growing and the town kept laughing, unaware of the hidden world quietly taking shape behind those closed doors. It might have stayed that way forever, if not for an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when Walter Higgins, a retired furniture restorer whose truck had broken
down on the road nearby, wandered toward the barn out of idle curiosity while he waited for a tow. He pushed the door open, and what he saw stopped him cold in his tracks. When he finally found his voice, he asked who had made all of this, and Caleb, embarrassed, admitted it was his own work, done alone with nothing but second-hand tools. Walter shook his head slowly and said that in 40 years of restoring furniture for a living, he had rarely seen craftsmanship carrying this much soul inside it. Encouraged by Walter, who returned several times over the following weeks with pointers no book could have taught him, Caleb reluctantly agreed to bring a handful of pieces to the county craft fair held each year in the high school gymnasium. He almost did not go through with it. The morning of the fair, standing behind a folding table with a dozen carvings arranged in front of him, he felt smaller than he had in years, certain people would walk past his table the way they had always walked past him in the hallways at school. For hours, that is exactly what happened, visitors drifting toward tables selling jam and quilts and painted birdhouses, barely glancing at the strange wooden creatures. Sometime past noon, Caleb slipped his hand into his pocket and closed his fingers around one of his mother's buttons, the one he always carried with him, and thought seriously about simply packing up early and going home before anyone else had the chance to laugh at him again. He had already begun wrapping his first piece in cloth when a young woman with a camera slung around her neck stopped in front of his table and stood there, staring in silence. Her name was Grace Ellison, a documentary filmmaker passing through the area on an unrelated project, who had stopped at the fair out of boredom more than anything else. She picked up the wolf sculpture and asked gently if he would tell her about it. Something in the way she asked, patient rather than mocking, made Caleb open up in a way he rarely did with strangers. He told her about the scrap wood, about teaching himself alone in the barn with almost nothing, and after a long pause, about his mother, and how carving had slowly become the only way he knew to carry his grief without being crushed beneath it. Grace listened without interrupting once, and when he finally finished, she asked if she might come film him at work in the barn. Over the following weeks, Grace put together a short documentary almost entirely on her own time. Quiet footage of Caleb bent over timber and lamplight, his father's weathered hands steadying a larger log, the wolf sculpture displayed beside Caleb's soft, halting explanation of what it meant to him. When she finally uploaded it, neither of them expected much to come of it. But something about the stillness of it, the plain honesty, struck a chord with people far beyond the borders of their small town. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times over. One comment from a woman in another state who had lost her own son said simply that she had watched the wolf howl and finally let herself cry for the first time in almost a year. Messages poured in asking if the sculptures were for sale, offering commissions, one man even asking Caleb to carve a piece in memory of his late wife, a request that made Caleb sit alone in the quiet of the barn for a long while before he finally picked up his tools again.
The same neighbors who had once laughed at the pile behind the Whitfield property began stopping by unannounced, suddenly eager to see the barn for themselves. And Caleb found himself surprised by how much lighter he felt each time someone looked at his work and saw not junk but something worth admiring. Orders kept arriving over the following months, enough that what had once been a lonely way of coping with grief slowly became the beginning of an actual livelihood for the both of them. Thomas took on extra hours at the store to help save toward renovating the barn properly, better lighting strung along the rafters, sturdier benches built by hand, tools Caleb no longer had to buy secondhand and worn down to nothing. On the day the renovation was finished, father and son stood together in the doorway, looking at the space that had once held nothing but a boy's grief and a pile of other people's throwaway wood, now transformed into a real workshop, sunlight falling clean across finished floors and shelves lined carefully with sculptures old and new standing side by side. Caleb thought quietly about how strange it was that the very thing people had once mocked had become the foundation for everything he now had, and how the wood itself had never been the problem, only waiting patiently for someone willing enough to see what it could still become. Thomas did not say much, as always, but he put his hand on his son's shoulder the same way he had beside the howling wolf all those months before, and for the first time he added something more, saying quietly that Ellen would have loved every single piece standing in that barn, and that she would have been prouder than anyone of the boy who had made them with his own 2 hands. Caleb felt his eyes sting, and for once he did not look away from his father's face, and in that shared and unhurried silence, something between the two of them finally healed a little more. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is the simple truth that worth is never decided by how something looks when it is first discarded, but by what someone is willing to see hidden inside it, and the patience they are willing to spend bringing it slowly into the light. And that this is true of broken timber, quiet boys, and grieving fathers who never quite found the words for what they carried either. If this story moved you even a little, consider staying with us a while longer, because the Kind Soul Stories was built for exactly this, for the quiet people, the overlooked ones, the ones the world laughed at before it ever gave them a real chance. And if you would like more stories like Caleb's, stories about resilience and love and the beauty found in the most unexpected places, subscribe and stay close, because there are so many more hearts out there just like his, still waiting quietly to be discovered. The educational and reflective value here centers on grief processed through quiet creative work rather than conversation, the wordless ways fathers often show their love, the worth of self-taught patience over expensive resources or formal training, and the broader truth that people and discarded materials alike are too often judged by their surface rather than their hidden potential.